All right, guys, welcome back. Today we begin a new study, and it will be Paul's epistle to the Thessalonians, that is, First Thessalonians. And so, as we always do before we begin to study a new book, we always give some introductory material to kind of help us to understand the book as a whole, to see its purposes, its themes, as well as other information that may be pertinent to our study. So, and in this introductory format that we always give, it kind of allows us to look at the book from a macrospective, to kind of stand back from the book overall and to see what the writer is talking about. Okay. And since we're talking about the writer, we understand that the writer of this epistle is the Apostle Paul. And we can see this for the most part kind of throughout all of this epistle within itself. That is what we call internal evidence. And usually, in speaking of internal evidence, that's how we can derive all of the rest of this information that we give to you guys for the most part. The rest of the information that we give in the introduction, like the purpose, the theme, and things of that nature. Internal evidence, that which is written in the scriptures itself, in the epistle itself, or whatever we are reading, internal evidence. But anyway, so the Apostle Paul is the writer of this epistle. The date that it was written is roughly around 50 to 54 AD, when Paul was writing from Corinth, and we see this for the most part in Acts chapter 18. Now, the occasion of the letter, and we can see this coming from Acts 17 and also Acts 18. So you can kind of bring holistically Acts chapter 17 and 18 as Paul speaks for the most part directly. That is, Luke speaks for the most part directly. In Acts chapter 17, I think it's somewhere around verses 1 through 10. And then we see the further actions of Paul. We continue on with Paul's continuing travels as he evangelizes the gospel in certain regions in the remainder of chapters 17. And then when we get to chapter 18, and we can see specifically when he is in Corinth as he writes to the Thessalonians. Okay. But anyway, so the dating of the letter comes around 50 to 54 AD as Paul writes from Corinth. Now, let's get to the purpose of the letter. The purpose of the letter, for the most part, is to check on, if you'll let me say that, is to check on the Thessalonians. You see, when Paul came back again to Acts chapter 17, when Paul came into Thessalonica and began to preach the gospel, he did what was common for him to do. He first went into the synagogue of the Jews, because Thessalonica was a very populous area. I think about as many as 300,000 people. It was a very commercial place because it was a port city. And thus, because of the mercantilism of the city, you will find a number of Jewish men who would be there and set up business there. And when you will find a great Jewish population, of course, you will find synagogues there. Okay, so it was a very popular city, a Roman city, to the which Rome had given the advantage of being a free city. That is, they were self-governed. So Paul entered into this particular city, Thessalonica, and there, as was common for him to do, he went into the Jewish synagogues, people who would quite naturally have an understanding and a relationship with Paul theologically, in the synagogue. So it would be considered from this perspective easier for Paul to evangelize these particular Jews, because what? They had an understanding of the law and the prophets. So they would understand Paul's positions and his religious perspective there. So Paul went into the Jewish synagogue, and there, I think it was for about 3 weeks, he evangelized Christ Jesus. And his point of preaching was that Jesus indeed was the Christ, proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to be persecuted, to be killed and to rise from the dead. So a few of the Jews believed Paul. A number of Greeks believed Paul as well, and influential people from the city. But for the most part, Paul's message amongst the Jews in the synagogues was rejected, and thus we see Paul turning to the Gentiles and began to evangelize the Gentiles. Now, Paul was having great success among the Gentiles, and the Jews who had rejected Paul's message of Jesus as the Christ had began to stir up trouble in the city, and thus they created a mob and began to drag out, namely Jason, drag out certain of these Christians who had responded, these people who had responded to Paul's message, Christians, and they persecuted these people. And thus the persecution became heavy upon these Christians of Thessalonica, and Paul was forced to leave the city. So Paul left the city. He went into the area, I believe it's Berea, and he began to evangelize. And there Paul was followed by those same Jews persecuting Paul wherever he was going. And so as Paul was continuing in his evangelism in that area, as he moved on, chapter 18, into area of Corinth, Paul became concerned because it was kind of clear that while Paul was in Thessalonica, some believed that he actually was there. Well, he was there for a brief amount of time. The question becomes, how long was Paul in Thessalonica? Some believe he was there for only a short period of time, relatively a little over 3 weeks. Some believe maybe as long as 6 months, because we find out in other places in the scriptures that those from Philippi sent a gift to Paul 2 times. But the bottom line is he wasn't there for long. So anywhere from around 3 weeks to 6 months. So because Paul was driven from the city so early and the persecution was so great, Paul became very concerned about the welfare of these new believers in Thessalonica. So he sent Timothy to find out how they were doing. And so Timothy went there. He found out how they were doing. And of course, ascertaining their spiritual welfare, he also determined how they were living and understood a number of questions that these confusions too, that the Thessalonians had. We'll talk about that. And so Timothy brought back to Paul the report that the Thessalonians were doing good, still under persecution by both the Jews and the Gentiles. And thus Paul responded back with the writing of First Thessalonians to comfort them. Okay. And so this is what we get. The purpose, the writing of First Thessalonians. He writes back after Timothy brought report. He writes back concerning them about their persecution, to encourage them to persevere under persecution and to remain joyful in their persecution, and also to strengthen them in their perseverance and to respond to some of their questions that they had and their confusion about the day of Christ. And we won't get into that in detail here. Epistle to the Thessalonians was very eschatological. That is, it would speak to things, doctrines, teachings concerning the last day. That is, the day of the Lord and the day of Christ. And so Paul would respond to these particular questions, because also we see in Thessalonians that the people had become somewhat lax in their waiting on the day of Christ, or waiting on the day of the Lord. And in their laxity that I'm speaking of, the people didn't work. So we'll talk about all of this once we get into didactic teaching in the epistle, once we begin to look at it microscopically, okay, verse by verse. But you can see how some of the people in their so-called waiting on the Lord had stopped working. And so one of the things that Paul encouraged them to do was to follow his example in working and taking care of themselves as they continue to look forward to the coming of Christ. There was also a confusion about those who had died. Some of the Thessalonian Christians had died, and thus the believers were beginning to lament because they thought that somehow these believers were lost or suffered some form of loss because they died before the return of Jesus Christ. And thus we see that famous passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 concerning what we call the rapture of the church. And this Paul wrote to encourage them in the Lord. And also too, Paul wrote to encourage them to continue in godly living, especially as it had to do with fornication. We'll talk about that in chapter 4. Okay, so for the most part, Paul maintains that division, that is the theological aspect of his letter. He would write with a theological aspect, and then he would write with the practical, encouraging them in practical living righteously, responding in somewhat to the theological aspect of the letter. And the theological aspect of the letter would be dealing with the instance of suffering, persecution, and rejoicing. Suffering, persecution, and rejoicing. The practical aspect of that letter would simply be living righteous in this ungodly world. So living righteous even under persecution. All right. Now, the very theme of the letter, and I've already touched on the theme of the letter, it would be persecution and joy. Both of them, persecution and joy. That is, that Paul would be teaching that persecution is a part of the Christian life. And we'll talk about that once we get into the passages itself. But that what? We are destined to be persecuted. In our persecution, in this predestined persecution, how should we respond? We should always have a spirit of joyfulness. Thus, we see the underlining theme of this letter. What? Persecution and joy. So, bringing the video to a close in our introduction, what have we seen? Number one, the author is Paul. Number two, the letter was written from Corinth around 50 to 54 AD, making this epistle one of Paul's earliest written epistles. The occasion, Paul wanted to check on the Thessalonian Christians because he himself was driven out of Thessalonians by these persecuting Jews, and the purpose of the letter to encourage them to continue even in persecution with joy, to strengthen their faith, to correct some of their theology about the day of the Lord, the day of Christ, and to encourage them to live a godly life, especially with respect to fornication. And finally, the theme of the book, persecution and joy. Okay, all right, guys. Thanks for joining me with that introductory material. Join me next time as we get into the text itself. All right, guys. God bless. Can't wait to get into it with you. See you next time.